Linda and I will be tag teaming, and Linda's really the face of this, or the grower face of our unusual symptom process. So when you call KVH, Linda is probably the person you'll be talking to most, and then I kind of fit in there as well in some of the process space. So really we're reporting the unusual. You probably hear us say it a lot, and this presentation is really just to try and tell you what does that really mean for you? So we'll give an overview of the process, and when we have the touch points with growers and also with MPI, and then we'll tell you what we do with these reports and why they're so important for industry. So I guess why report the unusual? Stu's touched on this a little bit, but it's important to understand what we mean when we say unusual. So unusual is really anything that doesn't have an obvious explanation for why it's happening. It could be something new on your orchard that you haven't seen before and you don't know how or why it's there, but it also could be a change in something that you previously thought was normal. So you may have a vine or two that are looking a bit funny, they're a bit old, and you might just put that down to age. If you see this spreading, if it looks like the incidence increasing, that's something that we consider unusual and we would like to hear about. As you mentioned, these unusual symptoms fall in the general surveillance space, and general surveillance is pretty important to facilitate early detection. And we know that early detection is one of the biggest predictors of a successful eradication. The earlier we detect something, it means the more options we have to try and manage it and get it out of the system. So this really facilitates that process. It gives the industry the best chance of identifying anything new or emerging. So that's just really touching on that point that it's about things that are new, but also things that are changing on orchards. So it could be things, organisms that we have in New Zealand that are interacting with kiwi fruit differently than they have previously, whether that's a new kiwi fruit variety or whether environment's changed and we're growing kiwi fruit in different areas, and so organisms are playing a bigger part in what we're doing. It's a bit of a busy slide, but this is really just to show you that we have a process that goes on with unusual symptoms. So we get the unusual symptom report. This can usually come through the grower, or potentially the growers reached out to their technical people to understand what's going on, and it's still puzzling them. So when it's puzzling and you can't find an explanation, that's when we want KVH to get the call so we can begin investigating it. So when we investigate, this is where we touch back with the grower and the people who reported it to us, and this is about gathering as much information as we can on the unusual symptom. So where it's happening, what's it look like, when's it happening, is it new, has it been happening for a little while, and getting all the information we can. And would probably at this stage as well, if we hadn't already, ask to receive some pictures so we could see what's it looking like. We take all that information and we determine the next steps. So this is where we kind of go out and consult with people. So this is technical specialists. We'll take what we've got through the investigation and ask them if they see any reasons why it could be happening or what they think could be happening. We also work within KVH. We have a lot of expertise in KVH about what happens on orchards, so we consult across our colleagues as well. I think it's important to note in this step that if we determine out of the next steps that it's not necessarily an organism that's causing the problem, it could be nutritional, for example, it definitely doesn't drop out of the system, it will just go into a separate part of the system. So we'll be sure to pass that information on to a technical person who can then feed back to the grower as well. So even if it turns out that it's not KVH-led, we definitely don't just let it drop away, it feeds back in so that the grower can get the information. So after we look at the next steps, we look if we need to collect a sample. So we'll contact the grower about collecting samples, and we know what samples to collect because we liaise with our diagnostic kind of partners. So we go to MPI with what we found, and if it's anything that's suspected to be new or potentially new, then MPI is the route that we'll go to get these samples collected. We also have another pathway that's recently opened up down at Plant Diagnostics in Christchurch, and these guys kind of take those unusual symptoms that MPI don't take because they don't think it's something new, but we still want to find out what's going on orchards, so then they'll do the diagnosis for us. And we liaise with them about what are the best samples to take, so whether it's root, soil, cane, leaf, so that we can ensure we get the best diagnostic for the symptoms we're seeing. So once those are all collected and sent, I think we need to just mention here that this next step between 4 and 5 isn't necessarily a really quick process. It can take quite a bit of time to get the samples sent, and to get the diagnostics done. But rest assured that in between these two steps, we will contact you. So if you haven't heard anything from us for a while, it's not that we haven't got back to you, it's just that we're waiting for the results. So we will get in touch with you once we get the results. So we received the diagnostic report, and our first question really is there something new to New Zealand, or is there a new kiwi fruit association? And this really dictates our next steps. So if there's nothing new or a new association, then this is where we'll go up to the red box, and KVH will take over the investigation and circle back to the grower with what was found and really provide, where possible, the best management advice to manage that organism on orchard. 90 to 95% of our unusual symptoms go this route, so that's the most common route by far. However, if there is something new to New Zealand, that's when MPI will open an investigation. And I think it's really important to note here that this investigation is done in collaboration with KVH, it's not in isolation. So MPI works with us to understand what's going on, and MPI is a great tool here because they have the resource, they have the databases, and they have the networks to be able to really quickly understand what the risk of this organism is to kiwi fruit. So again, 95% from here also go down to this red box where they turn MPI investigates and it looks like there's a little or low risk to kiwi fruit. So then they'll circle back to KVH and we'll circle back to the grower to let them know what's happening and provide advice. This tiny arrow, I could probably make it a pencil line because that's how many get down to this end. But there is a small possibility that after the investigation, MPI and KVH determine that there is a significant risk to industry. And that's when we will start conversations under GIA about how or where we should respond. And I think it's important to note again that this is collaboration. So KVH, MPI working together to make sure that we get the best outcome for the industry. And Linda's going to touch base.
Good morning, everyone. Just wanted to give you a bit of a feel for the number of reports that we do get through, and this has been increasing year on year, which is fantastic. So I guess it's a level of confidence that you will get a report or a result at the end, but also just awareness of growers on we're getting more and more observational on our own orchards. We're aware we've got climate change going on. We're aware we're growing in slightly different regions, and sometimes we might see things that are actually quite unusual. I mean, even this last bud break we've had, not a biosecurity incursion, but certainly unusual. So it's just threading them together. So this year we've had 37 through from growers or various sources up to this point. And as you can see, there's a range of directions that they went. We had 10 pest or insect follow-ups. A couple of nutritional disorders, growers concerned about leaf colour, things like that moves down through nutritional experts there. Early spring, got a few calls around some what ended up being frost-related damage to buds. So why did we even get a call like that? Because the grower said, I don't get frost. I've never had frost on this orchard. Well, this year we had frost on the orchard, and so it was just a matter of working through. Yes, that's a frost effect there. We've got a few reports in the pipeline at the moment, and they'll track their way through. So we're getting reports from across the varieties of kiwi fruit, the Hayward, Goldtree, Bounty, Bruno, and we got an interesting one on Cryptomeria, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Also, remembering that the KPCS nursery scheme, the nurserymen there are also very attentive of what's going on with the plants as they bring them through. So if they see anything interesting or unusual, they also send them through. And as you can see, there's a range of regions from which we've received reports. And now, okay, so I'll just run through a couple of studies, and the first one's one that came in from the Hawke's Bay. So this was an orchard manager who made contact with KVH because they were seeing some mushy buds when they went out and did their monitoring of the canopy as it was being tied down through the winter. So the orchard did have PSA, and our expectation is probably those buds may well have been infected by PSA, but it was unusual for that grower. He hadn't seen that symptom in his orchard, so he gave us a call. So we said, well, we can take a sample of this and we could put it through to Hill's lab for testing to confirm PSA. But we said, But it's always really good to get a better understanding of the extent of what you're seeing to see if it matches a pattern. So we asked him to go and survey his orchard, which is actually quite a large orchard, and he came back 2 days later after a few kilometres on his 4x4 bike, which was excellent response on his behalf. And he said that he'd come back noticing a bit of a pattern where most of the symptoms were prevalent in an area where he'd seen a poorer bud break that spring. They'd had a bit of a drop in their production that year, so he was also interested in understanding what was causing that poor bud break. I mean, we know bud break can be patchy in gold 3 on some years for some reasons, and sometimes we never kind of work out why, but it had made him a little bit interested. And as he'd done his survey, he noticed that the area of the blocks where he was seeing these more mushy buds, he's also noted a number of trunk cankers, they'd always been there, but just not noticed. So that's the value of, having a look around. So we got in touch with the MPI lab and said, well, this is the picture, this is what they're seeing. What sort of samples shall we get taken? And then with the help of our regional coordinator, Gaz Ingram, Gaz linked up with the grower and we sent some samples through to MPI for diagnostics. So the diagnostic report came back pretty detailed. So this is a accumulation of the organisms that were found across those 3 samples and where they came from. So if you see for the buds, there were 3 organisms isolated there, but MPI advice was that they were probably secondary colonisers. They probably weren't causal of what was going on in the buds, and probably we're still thinking probably it was PSA that it might have caused the initial damage. So for the trunks, there was some Ilionectria and also Fusarium solani identified from those samples. So they've been associated with kiwi fruit diseases previously, so probably had something to do with the ill health of the plant. So interesting, and then other organisms were identified back to us as suggested as probably, again, secondary colonisers. The one in red was interesting. So that one came back and MPI initially reported it to us as suggesting it may well be new to New Zealand. So it was something that they reported back to us to give us a heads up, and even at that point there was the question, so is there anything that we need to do differently on that orchard for that period when you're just working that investigation through? From the preliminary reading that they'd done about the organism, they suggested there probably wasn't any need for any different actions on the orchard for that time of year. And then quite shortly after that, they came back and found, in fact, that fungi had in fact been previously detected in New Zealand and reported in association with prunus species. So that was great. No different actions were needed on the orchard, and the association of that fungi with kiwi fruits now down in the MPI database. So there was a bit of learning there. And for the root samples, there were some fusariums, which probably had a little bit to do with the ill health of the vines. So that it was thought that that block probably, if the drainage could be improved a little bit, it would lead to reduce the poor health in that block and reduce the risk of ill health due to a complex of organisms. When we took that information back to the grower, he said we actually cleared the drains on that block back in October and we noticed a significant drop in the water levels, so that land had been holding quite a bit of water, and also they'd had quite a big rainfall event and the rain had sat in parts of that block for about 2 days, so it matched up. The other one is a Tepuki example, and so this one is around a cryptomeria, and for this one, the orchard manager back in 2019 noticed that he had 5 or 6 cryptomeria trees that weren't looking that well. He didn't take too much notice of it, but he was a little bit curious because they were actually 2-metre trees, and he was also interested in the pattern of effects on the trees, the bright green and then the brown rather than any yellowing in between. So 2020, he noticed that actually now there was quite a few more of these affected plants on the site, so this was less amusing for him. And when he actually went out and visited another couple of orchards, which were about within 5 kilometres of this particular site, he noticed also there was some disease in the trees there too. So he became a bit interested in trying to work out what it might be, because it did appear to be different. It seemed to be spreading. So again, they had a chat to us and we said, so what's the big picture? How many are there? Is there any patterns? Like, are they grouped or are they widespread, or is there anything obvious that you can see? And in counting them, he realised that there's actually quite a number more than he would have first thought, so that was valuable within itself. We sent away some samples down to Plant Diagnostics and came back with the results from root samples identifying 2 Phytophoras, a cylindrocarpin species, and Pythium. So it was expected that the Phytophora was probably causal in the disease for those trees, that Phytophora cinnamomi is the one that gives our avocados quite a bit of grief, and the Cryptogaea was reported to us as quite an aggressive one, so there was quite a need for to think about what might happen next. It was also identified that there was a weaker pathogen which causes conifer cankers in the trees, so there was something else at play there, and it was just identified to us, and that could spread through mechanisms such as a shelter belt trimmer. So there was a bit of a prompt to do some management actions on that. So what the grower was prompted to do was it was a foliar spray or drench with a chemical containing some sort of phosphorus acid, was recommending for the Phytophora trees and also the trees alongside, to try to reduce that spread. Attention to drainage around the trees, and also if replanting, the message was very strongly to remove and destroy any infected plants and plant debris, and be aware that Phytophora is a soil-borne organism, so take care around the movement of that soil, because you could unwittingly move that disease around. For the stem of the tree, it was identified that it would be wise to prune the affected tree and to put a copper fungicide across it to just keep that tree going a little bit longer. So kind of two examples where something was unusual, might not have been unusual for anyone to find, but it was unusual in that situation. And I think in both cases, that knowledge of what was going on was valuable. Thank you.
Cool, thanks, Linda. And yeah, I think those 2 case studies really highlight that process and the importance of closing that loop, and also of the relationships we have with different stakeholders to ensure that we get the best result. So I really just wanted to touch on kind of diagnostics, and that's because, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been major strides in improvement in plant diagnostics. So previously, things needed to be cultured up, and then they did morphological methods to help identify the species. And this really relied on, the organism first being able to be cultured, but also it was quite time-consuming and laborious, and there needed to be quite experts in taxonomy to be able to identify the species. So molecular diagnostics such as sequencing have come a long way, and this means that we get faster, more reliable, more sensitive methods to detect species that we're seeing. We also know that disease, as you probably saw from Linda's examples where we had 15 isolations across an unusual symptom, disease can be caused by a complex of organisms or a number of organisms and how they interact with each other, which also makes diagnostics sometimes difficult. So these new molecular methods, such as sequencing, they do tend to spit out potentially more new to New Zealand, as we saw in that other symptom that Linda had, that diaporte, that was originally reported as new to New Zealand. But what they did is they ran that sequence from that organism in a database, and they found an isolate back in 2010. So that just highlights that these methods are really useful in understanding what is actually new and what has been here and what the risk is. So I guess, they could be renamed, so, they're not really new, but they do have a new name. And these complexes are getting separated into species more and more often. So, 10, 15 years ago, we may have had a complex. Now it's broken out into 5 or 6 different species. When we're seeing those species now, that means that they aren't actually new to New Zealand. They have been here a while, but they've just potentially got a new name. And then those previously unidentified species. So I think really the point of this slide is the more and more unusual symptoms we're getting, which is really great, and the improvements in diagnostics, when you put those two together, Receiving a potentially new to New Zealand or a new host association doesn't necessarily mean there's a high risk, and that's the real purpose of that investigation process and using MPI's networks to understand. So I think this is probably one of the key messages, is what do we do with these reports? So it's all about sharing the knowledge. So KVH aims to get these reports and filter them through and put them on the website so that people can see what's happening in Orchard. We also filter this information through some of our other channels. So we have technical meetings with post-harvest and other technical guys, and we often share what we're finding on Orchard and getting some kind of feedback about what they're seeing as well. So it's really important that everyone kind of works together so we can understand what's happening across the industry as a whole. And it's also about creating good management practice advice. So painting a picture of what's happening across New Zealand. The clearer the picture we paint, the more refined our management advice can be. And I think a real benefit for the growers is understanding what's happening on Orchard, but also understanding how to manage what's happening on Orchard. So the more reports we get, the better our management advice can be and more targeted, which really feeds into that understanding changes in risk profile. So just highlighting that it's not necessarily about what's new, it's about what's changing on Orchard and what we need to be aware of so that we can manage it as soon as possible, which really feeds into this top point, which is research extension. So we take what we find on Orchard through these unusual symptoms and we feed it through our research group. So the Biosecurity Steering Group, we have a standing item that talks about the unusual symptoms we're finding. And we use that real expertise and knowledge in the room to understand where we best target our research money to get the best bang for buck for the grower and for the industry, which will feed really nicely into the next presentation, which is around that. And part of that was what we were seeing on Orchard and what we needed to look at. That's me and Linda.
Excellent. Any questions? Yes. And when you're asking a question, apart from waiting for the microphone, can you also just let us know who you are and where you're from, so we've got the context of the question, just to put you on the spot, Tim.
Hi, Tim Fraser, Biosecurity New Zealand. I'm just wondering, in that campaign about reporting anything unusual, has there been an increase in notifications through the program?
Yep, I think, we've really been pushing it and it is steadily increasing. Linda's probably the one who receives most of the calls, but yeah, we are. We're really actively pushing it now. General surveillance is one of our kind of key focuses, and as we push it more, we are getting more reports, which is great.
So, selfishly,
yep.
In terms of surveillance, increased calls to you guys going to put pressure in terms of responding. Have you kind of thought about what success might look like in terms of problems caused?
I guess success is really early detection, but it is, we see a real benefit. It is, as you saw the process, it is, fairly labour intensive to go through that investigation within KVH, but the benefits at the other end, are tenfold. If we get an early detection and we get it through the system as early as possible, then it's all kind of works itself out in the end, I think.
So the other thing is building up a bank of program for people to be able to refer to.
Yeah, exactly. So building a picture so that, ultimately, there will be a referral. You can have a look over here, and if anything else, you can come to KVH. So we're still painting that picture. We're still fairly early on in getting an idea of what's happening out there, but it's coming together.
Linda Hawes, horticultural consultant. I'm just thinking about that pathway that you showed us of how you proceed through when something is new.
Yep.
That a grower or any person has seen. There's a bit of a time delay between when you might collect a sample and when you find out, hopefully, what it is.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of process while that time is ticking by, if there's a possibility that the thing turns out to be an organism that could cause a major biosecurity event
Definitely.
to contain or control or hygiene procedures on that site?
We definitely feed back to the reporter or the grower hygiene, good biosecurity practice. So, not taking plant material from those blocks, avoid using them where possible. If you're working on the orchard, go to that block glass so you're not potentially taking what's there. So we definitely do have good practice that we relay to the grower. I guess when we talk to MPI and kind of that consultation process, if they have a real concern as well, then we can ask for voluntary measures. So we can ask growers to, voluntarily not do things, or even more. But usually at that stage, we're not sure what it is. So we just ask for voluntary kind of good practice, and that generally covers it.